Welcome, everybody. We are so happy to see you. My name is Barbara Woods. I'm one of the core members of the Environmental Justice Team at Fourth Universalist Society in the city of New York. We're delighted to welcome you tonight to hear our health expert, Megan Wolff from Beyond Plastics. We're so lucky to have Megan. She is a public health historian, uses history to inform policy. After receiving a master's and doctorate in public health from Columbia University, she spent over a decade at Weill Cornell Medical College, where she developed a mental health policy initiative with the Department of Psychiatry. Megan believes that climate change is the greatest threat to human health, and the production of plastics touches on every phase of the climate fight. She recently served on the Minderoo Monaco Commission on Plastics and Human Health, which published a full review of the subject in the Annals of Global Health in March 2023. And Megan lives with her family in New Paltz, New York. So she does not have to deal with the mess in New York City subways today, although she has to deal with the flooding. So welcome,
Yep.
Megan. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for all of your work.
Thank you, Barbara. Yeah, I lived in New York for more than 20 years, so I feel all of your subway pain. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. It's really fun to be here today. I've been kind of in touch with Barbara on and off for, I guess, years now, because Beyond Plastics and the UUs are very close. You have a tendency as a congregation or many congregations to be very social justice and environmentally justice focused, as is Beyond Plastics. So I know that at least someone from my organization may have spoken to this group before, but it's good to be here. So today I'm going to give you a bit of background about what we consider to be the plastics crisis. What is the crisis? What is the problem? And then what we can do about it. Actually, this is a slightly new presentation for me because I'm focusing so much more than usual on what we can do about it because New York State is right in the middle of the thick of it. Right now, there is legislation pending in the State House right now that, if it passes, would literally be the most progressive anti-plastics legislation in the world. And having just served on a global initiative fighting plastics through the Minderoo Foundation, that's a pretty big statement. So I'm going to be talking about that in the second half of the presentation and how each of you can push to help it get passed. It's important to pass it in New York because what happens here happens everywhere. Partially because New York State is such a big market. Anything that happens in the market in New York is going to happen across the country. Manufacturers have to take notice. And partially, frankly, because New York has such a reputation among all of the states for having so many special interest groups and lobbies of individuals, of you name it, any kind of interest working on laws together. Basically, if it can pass in New York, it can pass anywhere. So other states keep an eye on what New York State passes, knowing that it will already have been vetted by so many different vociferous interested groups that it can probably pass like that at home. So once we get this passed, it could really change things tremendously. So let's get into the subject matter, shall we? So as was mentioned by Barbara, my background is in history, is in medical history. And in studying that, there was one big lesson that I took, most historians do, which is that history is not inevitable. History is created by people. And problems that are created by people are not inevitable either. They're solvable. What we made we can unmake. And this is a super useful lesson if you're looking to inform policy, because you want to look backward at history and figure out where did we zig where we could have zagged. And then work on that point or many points. And there's usually many points. But you can also, by looking backward, identify the actors who made key decisions at key moments, think about why, and think about how those things might be changed in the present or future. So that's what I've been doing across my career. And there's no place to do that quite like the plastics crisis, which is, it's a few-fold crisis. But the very central thing is we've just got too darn much of it. We have manufactured as a species nearly 10 billion tons of plastic since 1950. Since 1950, plastic production went up 200-fold. Um, that's an awful lot of plastic, and it's a lot more plastic now even than we have people, and it's slated to triple. In fact, here you go. Here's some global plastic production. Looking at this graph as a historian, though, I noticed something interesting and actually hopeful. Despite the fact that we are drowning in plastic, which is mostly not recyclable, which I'll talk to you about, and certainly not compostable and not biodegradable. Okay, we're swimming in that, but this is very interesting to me historically because this is half of all of the plastic ever produced by humanity is just in the last 20 years. Now, going back to say 2003, I was in New York City, I was in grad school. What was life like back then? Well, it wasn't like we had a tragic lack of plastic. It wasn't like everything was so inconvenient that I was walking around New York City or anybody else was saying, you know what I need? I need more plastic so that I can more rapidly buy single-use grocery packets of this, that, or the other. Life was pretty much as we recall it. I had an iPhone in 2003, I think. Oh, no, wait, no, maybe that was 2009. Anyway, though, it wasn't that different. So if half the problem that we created is basically 20 years old, that is the blink of an eye historically. That is something that we can look back and say, okay, what happened? How did things come to be this way? And then we can change it. And to put it into perspective, this is the cat that I had for 20 years, straight through graduate school. Her name was Zoe, 20 years old. That's the length of the plastics crisis. So the lifespan of a cat is the length of the plastics crisis as we have it today. Very solvable. Lots of hope here. So what are we using all of this plastic for? Where is it coming from? What's it doing here? Well, this is really worth noticing. More than 44% of all of the plastic currently under production is packaging. Most of that is single-use packaging that we use and discard like that. We use it for barely minutes once it reaches us. So that's a lot of low-hanging fruit that should not be that difficult to change, to reduce, to remediate. Some of the other sectors, okay, building and construction, that's a different story, but textiles is another of the biggest ones. About 70% of textiles now are made from polymers, meaning that they are derived from fossil carbon, oil, coal, gas. There are lots of ways to turn those things into what winds up later feeling almost like, cotton. But those don't break down either, and they get everywhere. And I will talk about that a little bit as we go on. But we're going to be looking through this production list for things that we can cut back on in order to reduce this tremendous burden of plastic that has been created over the last several decades. Well, okay, that's the plastic we're making. So where's it all going these days? Looking around in the city, it often feels like it's not going anywhere. It's just around. And, that's true up here in New Paltz, too. There's plastic garbage everywhere. And in fact, that can be almost useful because it means that there are almost no plastic pollution deniers. Nobody much can say, hey, there's not a problem, when literally all you have to do is look at your feet and you're probably standing on some discarded plastic. But technically speaking, where is it going? Well, here's a nice chart for us. So of all of that plastic, first of all, I want to point out that this little arrow right here is all the plastic that has ever been recycled, which is about 9% total of plastic that ever existed on this earth was recycled. In the United States, the recycling rate is about 5 to 6% of what we put in our bins gets recycled. So that's tiny. Most of it goes to landfill, where it sits and it leaches, and it's not gone when it's in landfill. Basically, not all objects thrown away remain thrown away, but a lot of it gets incinerated. Effectively, the incineration of plastic turns plastic pollution into air pollution. This line here is mismanaged plastic, which is a euphemism for litter, and that's massive. But what really blows my mind here is this ocean plastics line. The first place that most people learned about plastic pollution, the first place that, it started to really bother people was the oceans, the shores, going to the shore and seeing so much plastic washed up, or people who dive or who snorkel or who spend time with marine life at all. We're starting to notice that the oceans were teeming with plastics. And yet it's just a tiny little fragment of this bigger picture, which says to me, wow, That's a lot of plastic. But let's follow a little bit of this out. Well, all right. So actually, I wanted to just get back to this mismanaged bit here. This is a lot more than the ocean plastic, right? And we are led to believe for the most part that mismanagement, of plastic is an us problem. It's an individual us problem. Some of you may have seen the incredibly problematic commercial that came out in the 70s, and yet it's still famous, of the crying Indian, so-called. It's actually an Italian American actor. And in this commercial, they said, like basically litter doesn't cause litter, people cause litter. And it had a lot of people throwing litter everywhere and a supposed Native American seeing this and weeping. And this was supposed to move people into taking care of their own garbage. It was sponsored by the Keep America Beautiful campaign, which was an industry group of packagers and marketing, basically. They knew at that time in the 1970s that there was a problem with how much litter was being generated that wasn't biodegradable, that people were just chucking around. And in order to stave off any kind of regulation, they generated this campaign. And with it, the idea that the consumer was the problem, not that, the concept of the disposable object, which is in no way biodegradable or even recyclable, is the problem. So ever since then, we've been getting lots of iterations of this, and the idea is that we should all change our personal choices and then this problem will just go away. Well, it will help, but none of us on this call created the plastic pollution crisis, and none of us can individually change it. It's not going to be our individual actions that do make big change, it's going to be our collective ones, and in particular, regulatory change to stop this problem at the source. And I'll be getting to how we're going to do that a little bit later. So this is what we were told to do. And this is what we like to do and feel virtuous doing, is recycling. The problem is, though, and you've probably heard a bit about this in the last few years because it's been starting to make the news cycles, it's not working. And part of the reason it's not working is that there's just too much plastic. There is just literally no way that we can recycle 10 billion tons of plastic. But more to the point, plastic was never designed to be recyclable. It was not created to be turned into other things. The word plastic comes from, I think it's the Greek, and it means to mold to shape. So the idea is you should be able to reshape it. But plastic has so many additives, and there are so many different kinds of plastic polymers, different kinds that have different additives. They have different molecular shapes. They melt it at different temperatures. You can't just throw them all in one big vat and come out with a Barbie dream house. In fact, you can't even throw all of the ones in a big vat, or the twos in a big vat, or the threes. And we'll talk about what those are in just a sec. But how did we come to think that we could? Well, here's the backstory. We were told that we could. The recycling symbol was created in 1970 by an art design student who won a contest. And in its first iteration, it was meant to represent the three main pillars: reduce, reuse, and recycle. And that's what each of those arrows is supposed to mean. And it was intended for items that are recyclable, like paper, like metal, like glass. And make no mistake, those items are recyclable. Keep on recycling your paper, metal, and glass. Recycling is not broken. But plastic recycling was never a thing. The symbol becomes democratized. It was an open source symbol. Anybody could use it. And we all got pretty used to using it in the 1980s on all kinds of stuff. And so by the mid 80s, I remember as a child going to the recycling center with my dad and putting everything in. And then we got curbside recycling, and they would come to, the house. I was living in the suburbs at the time. That was really cool. 1988, people have gotten really used to recycling and seeing the recycling symbol, and that's the point at which the plastics industry starts to realize that people are pushing back because they're looking at all of this plastic stuff and saying, wait a second, I can recycle everything else, but not the plastic. Well, I don't want to buy it in plastic if it's not recyclable. So the industry borrowed the chasing arrows and altered it because they could, because it was an open source symbol. It didn't have a copyright. So they borrowed it and they put these numbers in the middle of the symbol. These numbers are resin codes. Each one stands for a different kind of plastic. And it's a family of plastics. So, PETE is number one. And it's no less diverse than, say, mammals. And, number two, HDPE is no less diverse than, say, Aves. Like it's a whole family of different types of plastics. But theoretically, each one of these might be recyclable along similar lines, if it's recyclable at all. Most of them are not. They have too many additives. Ones and twos, yes, mostly, with a number of exceptions, and fives occasionally, with many, many exceptions. But the idea here was to put all of the numbers, all of the types of plastic in the recycling symbol, and it was ingenious because it gave all of us the idea that we could recycle all of it in some way, maybe on Mars, but somewhere, somehow, this was recyclable. And it prompted what we call wish cycling, which, if you're anything like me, up until a couple of years ago, when I started working at Beyond Plastics, studying this stuff full time, I thought, well, if it's plastic, it's recyclable. I'll put it in the recycling bin and it'll somehow magically come out and be a Barbie dream house. So, black plastic, plastic bags, garden plastics, utensils, all of it. Put it in the recycling bin, and the Sims Recycling Center will figure it out. Well, that's not what's happening. Make no mistake, no matter what your local recycler tells you, including Sims, which collects 1 through 7, it's plastic, they take it. Only ones and twos are reliably recycled because they're the only resins for which a reliable market exists. If there's no market, it's not going to change hands. It's just garbage. And nobody's going to lose money on recycling. Recycling winds up being taxpayer funded for the most part, but then you also have private companies like Sims that come in and they're trying to make a profit. They cannot make a profit if no market exists. So where does the New York City recycling go that's not ones and twos? A lot of it winds up in New Jersey in incinerators. A lot of it winds up in landfills. And a lot of it winds up being sent offshore to basically developing nations. And that's another slideshow. That's a different talk, and I'll very happily come back to give that talk. But that kind of distribution of plastics is part of how it gets so far out of the litter box, as it were. That's part of why so little of it is captured, because there's no incentive to capture it. So it winds up everywhere. So again, well, where is it all going? Let's talk a little bit more about this mismanaged and ocean plastic. It's going into the environment. It's going everywhere we look. New York City is a port city. A lot of us don't really think about it because we don't spend a lot of time contemplating the water. We're contemplating our lives, but it's there, and there are seabirds. And if you go out to, Jamaica Bay, to the areas where there are waters and there are in particular wetlands, what you'll see is very disturbing, because you'll see animals and an ecosystem trying to be resilient by incorporating all of this plastic. They can't get rid of it, but it's a false resilience because there really aren't animals that are resilient enough for this onslaught. This is not a New York City site, clearly, but this is what's happening all over the world on land, which is that the plastic is blowing around, and anything that's grazing, anything that's a ruminant, is chewing on it. These camels are literally starving to death because their stomachs are plugged with plastics. And this is happening across species. It's happening across it's happening across seabirds. 99% of seabirds are affected in ways similar to this. It's happening across aquatic species. And the more we study terrestrial species, the more we're seeing this too. Well, part of the way that this is happening is that about 18 to 15 million tons of plastic are entering our oceans every year. This is the equivalent of a garbage truck a minute backing up to the ocean and dumping its load. But it's getting there through all kinds of means. Mostly it's actually washing in through rivers. And what's happening in the oceans, so we're having plenty of animals that are eating it, but then we're also eating plenty of those animals. By 2025, 1 year from now, it's predicted that for every 3 pounds of fish in the ocean, there'll be a pound of plastic. At this rate, by 2050, it's going to be a 1-to-1 ratio. And industry has plans. It is on track to expand production such that this is the case. Well, once it's in the water, what happens next? Well, it floats around, it gets eaten by animals, but it breaks down. Breaks down on land too, but water seems to accelerate the effect because the wave action and the sun and just the constant moving and the pounding, Plastic will get brittle. All plastic gets brittle when it's exposed long enough to the sun and it ages. It gets brittle, it breaks down, and then it breaks down some more, and it breaks down some more. Now, plastic will never actually break down really in terms of biodegrading. It breaks up into tinier and tinier fragments. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with the term microplastic. Technically speaking, a microplastic is anything smaller than a pencil eraser. So some plastics were born microplastics, but a lot of others break down. They don't stop at micro, though. They go all the way down to nano, which is smaller than a human blood cell and smaller and smaller and smaller. Effectively, it's a measurement issue. Every time humans are able to better measure smaller and smaller items, we're able to identify more plastic. Here's a microplastic filament on a snowflake. Now, this is what I said I was going to get back to about the textiles. So that filament would have come probably off of somebody's clothing. Anything that's made out of fleece or polyester, rayon, nylon, any of those is going to be shedding microfilaments constantly. About half of them come off while you're wearing the item, half of them are coming off during washing and drying, but they're just constantly shedding. And so are sheets and carpets and upholstery and anything else that's made out of polymer is just going to be shedding. It kind of, all plastics work a little bit like skin insofar as, our skin is always just shedding cells. So are plastics. So this guy got picked up by a snowflake. That's how small they get. And because they're that small, they evaporate up into the hydraulic cycle and come back down on Earth literally everywhere. So there is plastic in the rain, there is plastic in the snow, there is plastic in the wind. It's effectively dust. Because of that, there's also plastic in the soil. Soil scientists are increasingly finding that there's more plastic in the soil even than there is in the water. Water was the first place we started to understand that we were in trouble, but now we're looking at soil. So this is a wheat plant, and the little red bits inside its vasculature are nanoplastics. The presence of those nanoplastics depresses crop yields in the plants. In the soils, though, it also affects everything, all the biota in the soil, from earthworms on down. It changes the way in which the soil absorbs water, but it gets into the stomachs of earthworms. It makes them about 30% less resilient. It gets into the fungi. Basically, the whole cycle that is soil is interrupted by the presence of these plastics. And we're only just beginning to find out what the extent of it is. This is an insect that was identified in Adirondack State Park about a year ago. It's completely covered with microplastic, basically like pollen. And what's interesting to me about this is that there are no plastic production facilities or recycling facilities or dumping facilities near the park. So how you get an insect that is this coated in microplastic is probably to do with the wind and the rain. And that gives us a better sense of what the background level of microplastic is in our environment. As a result of this, we are definitely eating and drinking and breathing microplastic constantly. And this was a big news week. Consumer Reports came out with an article about plastic in our food because it's across the food web. And then the Washington Post came out covering a study from Columbia University about microplastic in water and nanoplastic in water. Basically, everywhere people look, everywhere researchers look, they find more microplastic and more microplastic than they did the last time. Some of that has to do with the fact that all of this plastic that's already out in the environment is degrading and is going to continue to degrade. So there will be more microplastic for the foreseeable future. But some of it is also our measurement techniques and the fact that we're looking. So, okay, if you can't beat them, then make fun of them. There are lots of memes going around on the internet. The dark humor web is moving because, what are you going to do? You can't not breathe. You can't not eat. There aren't foods that you can avoid to not have microplastics in you. It's through the whole food web. So we're laughing at it. Have a little dash of microplastic with that food. Here's the food pyramid created out of basically a base of microplastic, bugs, lab-grown meat, soy milk, and antidepressants. In my line of work, I find this very funny. I don't see anyone laughing, so I'll just keep moving now. Doopy doopy doop. But this is the issue with the breathing of it. This is from a study that analyzed human lung tissue and looked for different types of plastics in the lung tissue, and of course found it. Well, where else in the human body are we finding microplastics? These are the ones we're breathing. What about the ones that we're eating? Are we passing those or not? Turns out we're passing 90% of them. Yay! But that's still 10% of microplastics that we're not passing. So where are they going? And just like the soil and the air and the water and the food, as investigators look at the human body, they're increasingly finding microplastics there too. This was an article that came out a couple of years ago, 2021, finding microplastics on both sides of the placenta in the human fetus. We found microplastics in the human gut, in the human bloodstream. Let's see, definitely lung tissue. God, there's so many. It's in breast milk. It's in heart tissue. It's in testicular tissue. Again, it's where we look for it, we're finding it. So I don't know about you guys, but I'm starting to get really stressed out. So these are my daughter's pet rabbits. We're going to take a mental health break here. Their names are Noelle and Lopsy. They are adorable. And if you ever want to think about resilience, think about rabbits, right? They just go on and on. They're fantastic. All right, back to the subject at hand. What does it mean? Everybody wants to know what it means, myself included. And at this point, medical researchers are really looking. Including this team that I was on. This was a team led by Phil Landrigan, who's this gentleman here. He's a pediatric epidemiologist and toxicologist who passed most of his career at Mount Sinai, where he was looking at pesticides in children, and prior to that, lead in children. And he's one of the people who managed to use the data that lead was poisoning children, that lead is a neurotoxin, and demonstrate why we had to get lead out of gasoline. And abating lead from gasoline was one of the most major toxicant cleanups in the 20th century. It made one of the biggest differences to children's health, IQ levels, neurodevelopment of any kind of legislation that passed in the 20th century. Similar legislation that made impacts as big as this was the banning of chlorofluorocarbons in order to save the ozone layer. And that in itself was also somewhat miraculous, that the scientific advocates managed to take the data and convince the world that this needed doing, and the world listened, and it was done. So Phil has been taking aim at plastic for the last few years, and he worked with the Minderoo Foundation from Australia to fund this study, which initially was 24 researchers from across the world. And by the time we finished a year later, 48 researchers, and we all probably aged 5 years in the process. We were exhausted. But what we did was we looked at all the existing literature on plastics and human health and crunched it and said, okay, this is the impact of plastics on human health. And so what did we find? Well, at the very beginning of the investigation, I was talking to colleagues and saying, well, what do we know? And luckily, I got to talk to this guy here, Christos Simonides, who is also a pediatrician and a toxicologist. He's in Australia, and he works with kids with ADHD and autism. And so he's looking at plastic across the blood-brain barrier. But he said, in general, with plastics, we know two things. We know what happens to plastic, to things in the animal model. When animals are overexposed to plastic or even regularly exposed to plastics, we know what happens to them. And we know eventually that what happens in the animal models is usually reflected in humans, and it's not good. And we know on a molecular level what we're dealing with for the most part, because plastic is a substance. We can analyze it. We can see what's happening molecularly, and we can tell what those molecules do to living cells in animals and in us. And that's not good either. So here's what we were looking at. Plastics are made from chemicals and fossil fuels. It's almost easy to forget that, like, my cell phone is largely made out of a petroleum product or a coal product. In order to do that, so many chemical additives have to be added that we almost forget, where it came from. But it's a long way, for instance, from a measure of petroleum to a plastic fork. Still, you get there. So how do you do it? Well, here's one of Phil's slides. What is plastic? So plastic is it's a polymer bond, a polymer backbone, mostly of carbon-carbon bonds, which are the strongest ones in Christendom, right? They're covalent. It is really hard to break these bonds, and that is why plastic is so durable, not breaking down. Then you add lots of additives to give plastic properties like being soft and pliable. So like phthalates, also to not burst into flame. So flame retardants, to be smooth, to be pink, to be any number of things that plastic can be. And plastic can be anything. And so you add those. And so those sit inside the molecules. And a lot of these we recognize ourselves, even as lay people, as like not stuff we want to eat, right? Like bisphenols, PFAS, can't remember exactly what it does, but I know it's on the do not eat list. So they sit inside this cell matrix, but they are not bonded to the cell. And that's the most important thing to think about in terms of what plastic can do to humans, because these chemicals not being bonded means that they migrate out all the way through the plastic life cycle, from production, manufacture, distribution, use, disposal, and so-called recycling. They are constantly on the move, and they get into everything. The more energy that the plastic is subjected to, the more they move. So if you take anything home from this particular presentation, do not microwave food in plastic, because you're energizing those molecules. There is no such thing as a microwave safe plastic. And the reason that it exists, that it's stamped on that, has to do a lot more with commercial law and basically industry's manner of protecting its market share from the concept of risk. I'm going to get too much in the weeds if I say much more. So I'm getting ready to teach a class on this. So I know too much and I'm dangerous and we'll just talk forever. But just don't microwave the stuff, okay? Because it's going to get in your food. That's called chemical migration. But also anything that's been standing in plastic for a long time, anything in plastic packaging, anything on plastic plates. Think of it this way. Humans stopped eating off of lead dishes for the same reason. Okay, so this is how we usually think about risk, how we've always thought about it, at least across the 20th century. We think about chemicals and we say, ooh, okay, chemicals cause cancer, right? And a number of chemicals are going to cause cancer. So that's what they call the threshold effect. It's this understanding or an assumption that, above a certain level, it's bad, and below a certain level, like the dose makes the poison and you're going to be okay. And so that threshold effect has always been applied to chemicals, except it turns out that with carcinogens, it's maybe not quite like that, because carcinogens can be more active and there's less of a threshold effect, according to the FDA. So the FDA had passed rulings in 1958 that said if it's a carcinogen, it can't be in food. And then they made a big exception for packaging. So vinyl chloride, polyvinyl chloride, that is a known human carcinogen. Styrene, massive carcinogen. Polystyrene. Then here's some other ones that are, okay, we've heard of them. Bisphenol A, carcinogen. PFAS, carcinogen. Phthalates, lead, chromium, halogenated flame retardants, cadmium, perchlorate, formaldehyde. All of these things are used in the production of plastic. Now, we know that there are over 13,000 chemicals in plastic. 2,400 of them are chemicals of concern, meaning that they're known carcinogens, or they do something else. Like lead is a neurotoxicant as well as a carcinogen. So neurotoxicants, or they're endocrine disruptors. And this is the game changer. This is why people are basically paying so much attention right now. Endocrine disruptors were more recently recognized. In the 1990s, it was a female scientist. I love it when female scientists get recognized for what they do. Her name was Theo Colburn, and she is considered to be a more modern version of Rachel Carson. She had a PhD in zoology, and she started to notice that in the Great Lakes in the 1980s, pollution was causing developmental problems in a lot of fish and birds and wildlife. And among those developmental problems, we're seeing extra legs in frogs. We're seeing fish with malformations. We're seeing birds with weird beaks. Now, Rachel Carson also started to notice the same kinds of things. But Theo looked at it and crunched the numbers and said, this is not carcinogenic. Some of it winds up being, but there's a through line here. What's happening to these animals is to do with their endocrine systems. Their endocrine systems, meaning their hormonal systems, all of them, the through line is hormonal disruption, because a lot of what she was looking at was fertility rates plummeting, animals that were unable to reproduce. So she and other scientists, she pulled together a conference of scientists in the 1990s. It's called the Wing Spread Convention. And they hypothesized that some manufactured chemicals, including pesticides and PCBs, a la Rachel Carson, dioxin, chloridane, and plastics like bisphenol A and phthalates, that those chemicals can disrupt normal development by mimicking or blocking the action of hormones. So that was the new hypothesis. And the hypothesis has borne out ever since. Everywhere we've looked, we have been seeing it in the animal models, and we're also seeing it in the human models. Now, they labeled these endocrine disrupting chemicals, and you might have heard that term being bandied around even in the last few years as people are starting to become more aware that, oh, EDCs are doing this, that, and the other. I don't know. I live in a rarefied world where people do bandy around that language. But in the case of plastic, well, for all EDCs, but plastic especially because it's so ubiquitous, low doses really matter. Because this is one where the dose does not make the poison. The timing and the type of endocrine disruption makes the poison. Anything in your body that responds to a hormonal signal can be disrupted by these kinds of chemicals. If they either block, say, androgen or testosterone or estrogen, if they block it, or if they look like it and they interact with some other cellular process that needs those things. So if you think about, well, what are these on-off switches across our bodies? What are they regulating? Well, they're regulating appetite and metabolism. So if those go haywire, you're looking at obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease. And they're also regulating brain development in fetuses and in small babies. So that's lower IQ, ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, all of that. And the way that they interact with the human body and cells, cancer. Breast cancer, prostate cancer, testicular cancers, all of those are on the uptick, especially in the young. Cancer in general is on the uptick in the young, and so are chronic diseases, most of which have the same endocrine inflection that Theo Colburn noticed. And of course, reproductive problems like early puberty, infertility, birth defects. The sperm count in the human body, in human male, has dropped 50% since the 1970s. We cannot say that correlation is causation. We cannot say that happened because of plastic. But we can say, as Rachel Carson did, that the background levels of these chemicals have become so high that they are most definitely impacting the natural world. And we're a part of the natural world. So what scientists now are calling for is pre-market testing and something called the precautionary principle, meaning basically test before you act. Don't put it on the market until you know what it's going to do. But that's another sideshow. Periods of greatest vulnerability to these kinds of chemicals, and particular to endocrine disruptors, are fetal development, infants, and toddlers. And of course, these are also groups that don't vote. Here's an example. DES. Many of us will have heard about DES. It was an estrogen mimic, and it was given to pregnant women for many, many, many years. And then it was found that it was actually causing all kinds of cancers in the offspring of those pregnant women, particularly the girls. The boys were having fertility problems, but girls were having vaginal cancers and other rare cancers. And so it was pulled from the market many years later, having discovered, oh, it's not affecting the grown-up, it's affecting the offspring. In mouse studies since then, they've been looking at DES, knowing that it's an EDC, to see, okay, at what point does it impact the developing fetus? And here's one where the same developing fetuses got doses of different dose. They got the same dose of DES at different days of gestation. So this one is an obese mouse, and it got 1 part per billion at 9 to 16 days gestation. This is the control mouse. It got none. It was normal. These two mice both had the same level of exercise and the same caloric intake, but this mouse's metabolism has been irrevocably disrupted. So that's what EDCs do, and that's why we're paying attention. Now, on the Minderoo report, what we came up with was it's actually not even the devil we know that we're afraid of, it's the unknown unknowns, because there are so many chemicals that go into plastics or that are created in the in the process of making plastic. Those are called non-intentionally added substances. We do not know what they are. Some of them are trade secrets, some of them are accidents, most of them are entirely unstudied. We don't know what's going on. We don't know what we don't know. But what we do know is really scary. Uh, and what we do know about microplastics in particular, those microplastics in the human body, we're saying, look, those are acting like Trojan horses. You are implanting in whatever way plastic into the human body, and it is going to continue to migrate. Those chemicals are going to continue to migrate from inside the human body for as long as the microplastics are there. So they can irritate tissue, as we know that they do in the intestine. And investigators are eyeing now, like a lot of intestinal disorders. They're finding, oh, look, there are a lot of microplastics where these intestinal disorders are. But they're also looking at, like, what is the impact of having this plastic inside our bodies? Trojan horse. Okay, that was really upsetting. So here's the therapy bunnies again. Take a breath. In fact, I'm gonna up my game. My Maine Coon cat. Maine Coons are these giant fluffy guys. Had kittens over the summer. So this is how, like, I managed to study all this stuff and just like stay sane. Okay, kittens. They were adorable. They destroyed my house. It was completely worth it. Loved every minute of it. So how do we solve this? Now we're going to get to the action, because this is where you come in, and this is where New York is frankly at the forefront of everything. Well, the good news is that if you're upset about this, don't worry, you're in good company. 75 to 80% of people polled everywhere, United States, everywhere, international, say they want single-use plastics to be regulated or banned. They understand what a problem this is. Even if they've never heard of endocrine disruptors, all you have to do is look at a wetland. So the political will is there. And now we need the political action. And in New York State, it's coming. The New York State Packaging Reduction and Recycling Infrastructure Act, which is currently in the State House. So we need the Assembly and the Senate to both vote yes, but it is there. And we have so many co-sponsors in both places. We think if we can get it to the floor, it'll be a go. Anyway, this act was basically like a Christmas tree for Beyond Plastics. It has everything that we could have ever wanted, more or less, in the present moment. So, things that it does, it establishes statewide what we call extended producer responsibility, which to me is like, you make it, you take it. You produced it, you have responsibility for it through its entire life cycle. You figure out how to recycle it, you pay the cost of disposing of it. You made it. Stop externalizing your costs. So it creates that. And doing that means, first of all, reducing plastic packaging, right? Single-use packaging, not very necessary. Reduce it by 50% in 12 years. Achieve a 70% recycling rate, not 4 or 5% or 9%, 70%. If you're going to claim that it's recyclable, make it recyclable. Refabricate it such that it is recyclable. Make consumer brands pay the municipalities for that waste management. Again, you make it, you take it, and reduce the toxic chemicals. That's really important, because garbage in, garbage out. If you have all of those endocrine disruptors, carcinogens, and so on in the original plastic material, and then you do melt it down because it's a 1 or a 2, and you can do that, and then you make another bottle, and you're going to add more new additives in order to make that bottle, now you have additives plus additives is mega additives. This is not something you want to be drinking a Coke or water or anything else out of. So take out the toxins so that we can have a safe circular economy. Totally doable chemically, by the way. Okay, so we'll drill down real briefly. So reducing plastic use and production, basically any company that grosses more than $1 million in sales or makes more than a ton of packaging has to do this. The little guys are exempted. So the little like cider maker down the street from me in New Paltz is exempted. The tofu factory on Canal Street is exempted. It's the big companies that get hit by this. Redesigning the packaging is actually not that hard, and there are examples of it all over the world. This Smarties bag is not made out of what we use in the United States. It's not made out of that like plastic, resiny, sort of like aluminum foily stuff. It's made out of paper. totally recyclable, not that hard to do. Save taxpayer money. Companies are going to cover under the law what it will cost. They'll pay the fees to cover the waste management in their packaging. Set up standards. If we can have standards for cars like fuel efficiency, we can have standards for packaging. Change the design. It all goes back to the same concept. If you change the design, it becomes much more recyclable, much less toxic, and reduce those toxic chemicals. This particular bill prohibits 15 of the most toxic chemicals from packaging. And this list is totally unreasonable. Don't worry about it. But I will point out that it's basically the same as the list I pointed out from the Minderoo report. So this is like a Minderoo report dream come true. Everybody can have lots of champagne at Phil Landrigan's house after this passes. Strong definitions of recycling, because this is one of those mealy-mouthed things that a lot of manufacturers are like, oh, it's recyclable. Oh, really? Where? Well, in Denmark, in one factory, which is actually the truth. Synthetic turf, AstroTurf, gets sold on the idea that it's recyclable. The only place in the world that recycles it at all is in Denmark. So that's quite a shipping fee. But anyway, strengthen the definition of recyclable so that it's actually meaningful. In particular, you may or may not have heard of this concept of chemical recycling. This is the application of extremely high heat and also a catalyst to plastic, basically to convert that plastic into mostly a fuel. It's a new kind of polymer. Basically, it's an oil. It's marketed as saying, look, we made this new oil, and from it, you could potentially make more plastic. But it's actually so dirty and has so many contaminants that you really can't make a new plastic out of it. The best you can do is burn it. So instead of burning the plastic directly, you send it through an energy-intensive process to make a fuel, which you then burn. And then what is that fuel? It fuels the process of chemical recycling itself. So it fuels the creation of fuel. You could just burn the plastic. But this is a way that industry has been trying to use the definition of recycling to protect itself, to not have to change its materials. We just published a report on this. Industry was very, very unhappy. We heard from some lawyers. It was fun. You can find it on our website. It'll tell you a lot more about chemical recycling. And also strong oversight and accountability. Manufacturers obviously want to be able to regulate themselves, which is like putting the smoking industry in charge of smoking cessation. It's not going to work. So we're putting in a lot of restrictions on that. So we are working hard on this, and I am here to urge you, beg you, implore you to join us. We have more than 60 organizations working on this. We go to Albany, we talk to people, lots of phone calls, lobby meetings, and so on, because it turns out, this is something I've learned in the last couple of years in working for Beyond Plastics. So if you're a legislator and you're on the fence about, passing something like this because you know that your industry sponsors are not going to like you and they're not going to fund your reelection campaign, it helps to hear from a lot of constituents. You hear every single day from lobbyists if you are a legislator. They come to your office, they're dressed really nicely, they're like pharmaceutical reps. They are very convincing and they know how to do what they do. But when the people from down the street come in and they bring their kids and they bring their parents, it's a totally different show. It's intimate. It lets you know what actual people actually want. And that's what we've been working with people to do. Contact legislators and tell them directly, hey, I'm a human, I'm a constituent, and this is important. So how can you get involved in this? Well, we've been having lots of meetings. You can reach out to my colleague, Alexis Goldsmith, and here's her email address. And she will send you materials to sign, to mail, phone numbers to call, resolutions to sign. All of it really helps. The difference in changing a legislator's mind is somewhere between 3 and 15 phone calls. So, if I represent the Bronx and I get 7 calls in one day about a certain issue, you're going to get my attention. And if I get 7 more, it might even change my mind. So this is the name of the campaign, New York is Not Disposable, and there are weekly campaign called bi-weekly. The next one is January 16th, so this coming Tuesday. We're asking groups, and the EJ group from the UUs could totally sign this petition in support of the bill, PRRIA. Sign the memo and say, hey, we're an organization. And on February 27th, we're sending a bus from New York City up to Albany to get individuals to come and talk to legislators. And that's actually what these photos were about. We had two buses last year of people, men, women, children, kids, everybody was there. And it made a big difference. And it feels like a party when you're doing it. I brought my daughter, which was awesome. So if you have your phone out and you want to sign that petition now, all you need to do is scan this QR code. I'll also send a follow-up email that could be distributed so that you have the actual links to click. But this is how New Yorkers can pass this bill in New York, and it will, I promise you, affect the entire country if it passes. Other stuff. This is the other thing you can do, and this is where I come in particular. So Beyond Plastics has been building out a program of local groups and affiliates for the last 2 years. What it is people at their kitchen table who decide they want to get organized, or groups like you who are already interested in organized saying, you know what, let's make it official. We're going to affiliate with Beyond Plastics, which doesn't actually give you anything like that you have to do. There are no have tos, but it does mean that you get put on this map. So other people who are looking for people to organize with can find you. So you would become a dot in the New York map. And then others coming around would say, hey, here's a group that's working on plastic stuff. And then you would also be linked in with Beyond Plastics. And we keep you up to date on everything New York plastic and up and coming. So we help you figure out what to do and when when you're ready to do it. Feel free to check out the map to see who's around us. But we have gone in 2 years, about 2 years now, from 0 to 118 groups, and it's growing. And I love this map because it scares the pants off the American Chemistry Council, which is the chief lobbying group. They are taking this very seriously. If you want to know more about tactics, about how to fight against plastic pollution, you can join me. I am one of my hats at Beyond Plastics is I run the trainings. There are 2 sessions. It's a total of 4 hours. Session 1 is a sort of a primer on plastics, such that you had, but then also on how to do civic action. And session 2 is actual campaigns that you can do, actions that you can take, how to get your letter published in the paper, how to get a person's attention, and so on. So it's free, it's online, and it happens quarterly, but I love filling up our trainings with people like you guys because you're paying attention and you are really valuable and important in the cause. So beyondplastics.org/trainings. I saw this the other day and I haven't stopped laughing since. Boss wants us to send a strong message, so we're going to write a well-informed, cohesive op-ed. That's one of the things that I will teach you how to do in the trainings. So go ahead and sign up in any capacity that you would like to be on our mailing list, to help with the New York's Not Disposable campaign, or to learn more about activism in general and how to fight plastic pollution, or become an affiliate with Beyond Plastics.